Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Kristen Zaleski. Hi, Kristen. Nice to
Hi.
see you. So, by way of introduction, uh, you're a clinical assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Southern California, and a licensed clinical social worker. I see here it says you providing individual and group psychotherapy for trauma, sexual assault, and bereavement in Los Angeles. And you've done some empathy studies, which is what we're wanting to talk about today. And there was a couple articles written about your work. One was it titled USC Study Feels Out Empathy in Students. Can humans be engineered to share the feelings of others? And then another one in the social work today was, can social work students learn empathy? So yeah, is that how does, in terms of introduction, is there more you'd like to say about yourself? And I want to
No,
hear
you did a
about
good
your
job.
study.
Yeah, thank you. You did a good job. I can tell you a little bit more about my background and how I started researching empathy, if that's helpful.
Great.
I've spent over a decade in the sexual trauma world and also at the same time studying neuroscience, neurobiology of trauma and interconnected relationships in psychotherapy. And in my neurobiology study group, we always sort of question, is empathy an inherited trait? Is it something that's taught? Is it something that can be refined in adulthood, if you're a victim of severe trauma, or if you're a veteran? And empathy. One of my students who interviewed in our first study said empathy is a casualty in the war zone, right?
Mm.
You can't be empathic in the war zone. So those who have been, trained to lose empathy, perhaps maybe they can be trained to gain empathy. And my dissertation research, right before I came to the University of Southern California, was on rape-related pregnancy, where I really felt that the women had a lot of empathy for others, but really lacked empathy for themselves in so many ways as being a victim of violence. And so when I found myself at USC as a professor, I posed to the group of clinical professors, why don't we start to see if empathy is present in our students and if we teach it like we all think we do. Empathy is a main focus, hopefully in all 2 years of your master's program, but definitely in the first semester when we teach you what social work practice is, what psychotherapy is, and how to engage clients. So there were 5 other professors. I'll name them now. Juan Arake, who's a clinical associate professor, Kim Finney, who's clinical associate professor and a veteran as well, Bianca Harper, who's clinical assistant professor, Jennifer Lewis, clinical assistant professor, and Mihal Fela Amit, clinical associate professor. And we all sort of put our heads together and the first year worked on I think we recruited over 300 students in our first study and had them fill out a questionnaire that's a highly reputable questionnaire on cognitive and affective empathy. And some assumptions we made came from our literature review because we were starting with nothing really. And one assumption we made was that second year students would have more empathy than first year students. That turned out not to be true. Second assumption we made was that females would be more empathic than males. That was true only in the affective scale of empathy, but cognitively they're pretty matched up. We thought that Hispanic students might be more empathic than other ethnicities, and that comes from the literature as well. That turned out not to be true. There was no differences in what kind of choice you make in your focus. For instance, if you're going to work in business, we thought maybe you'd be less empathic than if you work with kids. That wasn't true. So the most significant things we found in that first study was women were more empathic on an affective level, and that online students, they didn't differ from the traditional classroom students, but in one area called emotion contagion, where you can actually feel another's emotion, that the online students were statistically significantly different than the classroom students. And so we're still working on getting that published. We also did some interviews with about 30 of them, 10% of our sample. And the interesting thing was is they really presented to us as if they felt social work school did teach empathy to them. So in the second round, we just finished a second year's worth of study. It was Juana Roque, myself, and some professors from Pennsylvania and social work school in Canada. We wanted to see if empathy scores would change from the beginning of first, so people just coming into the Masters of Social Work program, if their empathy would change over their first year. And surprisingly, it didn't in all three schools, which is in Canada too. So all three curriculums, it doesn't seem to be changing how people cognitively or affectively deal with their empathic responses over their Masters of Social Work training.
Okay, well, I'm hearing kind of two different things there. One is that you've worked in the field of trauma, so you're really interested in terms of can people who have trauma learn or increase their empathy, is kind of like one area. And then the other area is that with social work students, does their empathy change from year to year? Is it when they're in the social work programs, and that you haven't seen a lot of change actually happen within the programs, either affective or cognitive empathy is kind of what I'm hearing. Is that?
That's right, yeah. The trauma piece, we, in the latest study, our Pennsylvania partners looked at trauma, particularly vicarious trauma and history of trauma, to see how that impacts empathy scores, and they're still doing those calculations right now. In the qualitative interviews, though, I will say my assumption with trauma was if you were a child of abuse or neglect, that you would have a harder time being empathic because it wasn't shown to you than those who had successful, securely attached childhoods. In the interviews, what I'm finding is it's the opposite. The ones who had really not ideal circumstances growing up, who didn't have caregivers who showed them empathy, really had a deep sense of, I don't want anybody to feel this way, this feels really bad. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to become a social worker and I'm going to help people because I don't want them to experience this. And the ones who had more idealized childhoods and didn't report as much trauma or abuse, they had a harder time understanding and being empathic to people who were in bad situations because they didn't have a personal experience they could draw from to help them understand how a single mother could have 3 kids and be on welfare and fighting being homeless. There was more judgment than there was sort of empathic understanding and connection in that.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is, you say, yeah, an interesting finding is that you're imagining people who came from traumatic backgrounds, that they would have less empathy, and you're finding that they actually have more empathy because they had that experience and they don't want other people to go through that, or they're more attuned to it. And people that haven't had that aren't so attuned to that experience of trauma. One thing that came up for me is I've been doing some work around empathic parenting, and I did recently a panel with 5 parenting educators, and we were looking at the different parenting styles out there, authoritarian, authoritative, indulgent, permissive, to the empathic scale. And it turned out everyone came from an authoritarian background. Wow. Which was like, wow. And so it's all these people who are coming from that. It's matching kind of what I'm hearing with you, that you might be getting a select group who is kind of the more attuned, maybe has more of that resilience, and that they really want to make a difference in terms of they're putting a lot of work into creating websites with tens of thousands of people, education material, and all that kind of stuff. So they're working very diligently to create that more empathic way of parenting. So anyway, I'm seeing a parallel there with maybe what you're talking about.
That's really exciting, actually, to hear, and I'd love to hear more about your work. Maybe when we're offline, you can send me some things that you're finding, because that's really, I guess, the crossroads we are at as a group is, well, our intention is that we teach empathy, right? So from a social work perspective, are we not doing a good job teaching empathy, right? Or are we just not able to teach empathy in the time frame in which we think we can? And then in what you're saying with parenting styles, there's some new neurobiology research on gray matter. Have you seen any of this?
Yeah, that there's
And
more gray matter if you have a very empathic upbringing, that you're kind of bathed in oxytocin, which is allowing your brain to actually have, be larger. And
yeah, and more connected, right? Because the gray matter are all the neuronal connectors. So, in what we know about sort of neuroplasticity, right? You would think that you could gain empathy as you get older. So, if that's true, we're not capturing it from a graduate school level, which is really for most of the participants a time when their brain's still growing, right? They're in their early 20s, so their brain's not myelinated yet. So you think it would be a sensitive period for us to introduce that.
I
and
see.
and maybe it is, but we haven't captured that yet. And when you get into more psychoanalytic theory, the two people I always come to is Heinz Kohut, right? And his idea of empathic mirroring, as a charge of parenthood, and sort of preventing narcissism. And the other person I always come to is Carl Jung and sort of his wounded healer concept, right? And that we all in the psychotherapy profession are wounded healers. And I hear that so much from the students who had not great life experiences up to this point. But I just can't find that final. I'm still looking for the moment where it helps me link the two together and understand what we're finding.
So you're looking for the connection. I didn't quite understand that in terms of the connection between empathy and having been wounded yourself. And what is the connection? Is that kind of what you're looking for? Is I hearing that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's something I'm questioning. I can't say that I'm looking for it, but I guess in a way I'm questioning it, and it's come up from the first study with the amount of people who had adverse childhood experiences and really felt that they were very empathic and became more empathic in school. I couldn't help but think of Carl Jung's concept.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well, there's another point I was looking at was so what I'm hearing is that there's not a lot of change in those years in social work. Is that correct? That's it. And that your sense is that would be a time where there's still a lot of neuroplasticity, and maybe you have some idea that you would like to foster more empathy in those years. And so that's kind of what you're looking at within the social work field.
Yeah.
So there is some, I've talked to, there's from the University of Arizona or, Karen
They're the
Gertie.
mecca. Yeah, they're the empathy mecca. We've looked to a lot of their studies. Siegel,
Okay.
and
Yeah, Siegel and Gertie's. So they did some, literature reviews, and they're saying that within social work that it seems so obvious that empathy is an important part of social work, but it's actually not really covered in the literature.
Yeah.
So they've been kind of like pioneers of, putting together material and kind of maybe advocating for that. So what's going on that it hasn't been talked about that much in the social work field?
Yeah, well, so when you do a multidisciplinary examination, I don't know if have you looked at sort of what happens to doctors and nurses and therapists?
Gets beat out of them.
Yeah, exactly, right? And that's interesting. We've done all this work with sort of the STEM sciences, science, technology, engineering, math, and we can see that when students go in, they have pretty good empathy, and when they leave, their empathy, like you said, is beat out of them. They're more empathy fatigue, right, at the end of their schooling. And in social work and psychology and marriage and family therapy, where you would think there would be a lot of work done, there's really very little literature on that. And University of Arizona is sort of our mentor, not that they're mentoring us, but the leaders. And we've really looked at a lot of what they're doing because they have some really interesting studies. And this year, I can tell you, I am co-leading our practice class, our first semester, first year practice class, where we talk about empathy specifically. And I have a unique opportunity to now follow each individual teacher and pair them up with the students and do a pre and post with the students. And also I'm going to look at the empathy rating of the professor themselves and see if there's any difference with how the professor is empathically, right, in their own empathy rating. And if in the teaching module, some teachers are successful at teaching empathy to students, where other teachers are more cognitively extracted and conceptual and not really teaching that basic function. And so I'm hoping that there's a silver lining in our pedagogy where we can find one or two professors that will actually change empathy scores of their classrooms, and then we can use them as case studies to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it, so we can integrate that across social work education, everywhere.
You're trying to find the empathy superstars in the social work field, and then kind of build on what it is that they're doing, and maybe expand that to within the field.
Right. Yeah, it's. I mean, in some ways, that in the latest article written on this research, I said to the journalist, I feel like I'm in an existential crisis, right? Because empathy is the building block of relationships. I don't need to tell you this, right?
Yeah.
You could probably speak about this much more than me, but it's at the center of any important relationship in our life. And if the only chance to develop empathy happens as a child, we need to be doing major work, in the early childhood realm to really reinforce this, to prevent sort of a nation of narcissists. And I say that using very strong language, but in terms of attachment theory, they do every decade, they look and see where the nation is in terms of attachment security. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can send them to you. In the latest survey done 2 years ago, we have dropped. It used to be 60–65% of the nation was securely attached. We've now dropped to barely above 50. Wow. And the attachment security that's grown the most is avoidant security, which is the narcissistic personality types, right? And going back to Heinz Kohut and his understanding of empathic mirroring, that's what teaching empathy in early childhood did, right? It's prevented sort of self-involved narcissistic personality structures. So I'm hoping that gray matter is adaptable to empathy, and we can continue to grow it and foster it and figure out that superstar, as you say, that can model for us how to do it with our 20-something-year-old budding mental health clinicians. But if not, I think I'm going to start really being interested in early childhood education.
Might be joining those parenting educators.
Yeah.
There is something about the social work field that, I mean, we can address this is, there's a school of social work here at UC Berkeley. I live near UC Berkeley. And I went to a conference that they put on. It was related to the Black Lives Matter community, all the events that were going on here. I went and attended, and I was kind of checking it out. And my sense is that there's that the School of Social Work, at least here, I don't know how it is in others, is they're very much into social justice. And it's like, it was huge. Everything was talking about social justice, but it's the social justice of seeing kind of like enemies. That it was like, in terms of the Black Lives Matter, it was, there's the politicians, bad guys, all these kind of bad people out there we have to fight against in terms of the social justice framework. there's a bit of self-righteousness in there, like, we are right, they are wrong. And so I don't know if that's kind of permeated, the social work environment in general, but it seemed that it was not based on empathy. And I just interviewed Lori Gruen, who's a philosopher at Wesleyan University, and she's laid out a philosophical framework, like an ethics of justice and an ethics of empathy. And she goes through and lays out the premises that the ethics of justice have different premises, like we're all individualistic beings, we're going for our self-interest. There's the notion that instead of focusing on relationships, you're focusing on kind of like abstract, externalized concepts, or whereas
you're extracted, right? You're extracted from the process.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So an ethics of empathy and care is that we are all in relationship. It's just that we're doing relationships not as good as they could be. So we're in this empathic, we're all, there's a sense of, instead of looking for these universal truths, it's looking for things within context, what's going on within the relationship of a context. And she lays it out quite beautifully, step by step, about 6 major differences in terms of the worldview. And my sense is the School of Social Work is very much into an ethics of justice. So I'm just wondering how that kind of resonates.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's different schools of social work, and what Berkeley gives, if I remember, is a master's in social welfare. And we give a master's in social work, and UCLA gives a master's in social welfare. They're the same degree, but they're different words. And I think the word is really important when we're looking at the area of study, because you'll either have more of a macro lens or a micro lens. And I can say confidently, I received my MSW from USC, and now I teach there, that we really value the micro component of social work. So we, and I'm not saying that the others don't, but I do think, and social justice is important to all social workers. It's part of our code of ethics. And I don't know how they teach their practice classes. And at USC, we have people who are practicing in the field teaching practice. And, the tenured faculty and the more macro faculty are the ones who teach the policy classes. So we really have differentiated ways of going, and students can choose if they're going to be more business or macro. They might get less practice classes with that empathy component, but the majority of our students are micro clinically focused. They're working with direct clinical work, and so they'll get a lot of the practice orientation. So I'm not familiar with Berkeley in that way, but I do understand what you mean. And when you talk about social justice and advocacy and politics in general, it can feel like an us versus them scenario, which I think is if I can insert my own sort of soapbox here.
Please, that's what we're here for.
I think in general, we as a society think in black and white. And as a psychotherapist, with my clients, and as a professor with my students, I always try to get them to see that you're never going to be happy if you choose black or white. You need to choose gray, right? And even in the sexual assault work that I do, many of my victims, have assailants that say they didn't do it. Right? I mean, the majority of my victims do. I'm not saying that the assailants didn't do it, but I do think that there's 2 contexts of reality, right, in which people live. And even when I do couples therapy in a marriage, right, I can sit and have the couple talk about who's right and who's wrong, but that's not a good use of our time, right? It's all about, let's repairing this, let's learn from this, let's see how you saw it, let's see how you saw it, let's move on. And I think that is the core of a relationship, right? It's the empathic sort of connection that we have. And when we have a black and white dichotomous view on things, we're never going to connect. And when I look at, the Middle East and the wars that we fight in the Middle East, I think about this a lot, is, there's this lack of empathy on both sides, right? It's absence of empathy and, generations of trauma. And so I think empathy is sort of the key to our success in the world, but it's such as society, we're socialized to be on one side or the other.
So it sounds like you're really looking at from that relational empathic space, having working as a therapist, you're seeing how that works, especially with couples therapy, right? You're listening to both sides, trying to get them to empathize with each other. So you're really looking at how to expand that empathy and as compared to this us versus them, black and white view.
Yeah. I'll say to my couples, when they start to fight, we can talk about this if it's a good use of your time. But in my experience, nobody ever says you're right, I'm wrong, right? Let's figure out what we can do together to bridge this and repair this, and understand what this activated in the husband and what this activated in the wife, so that we know that gets activated, and we can be aware of that as we move forward.
Okay, well, that's pretty much where I am too, is like, how do we increase that empathy in all walks of life? How do we do it interpersonally? How do we do it in the classroom? Especially, how do we do it in the family? It sounds like you're looking at, can empathy grow at a later stage in life? I know from myself, I come from a conservative, evangelical fundamentalist family. And growing up, there was all those conflicts because I was kind of more the progressive side. And, I thought I was right, had my self-righteousness, that they did too, and kind of going back and forth. But I've just found that by, I advocated, started learning more about empathy, saying, we need more empathy. They still didn't understand it. It was kind of strange for them. But that I was able to, conflict started several years ago between some family members. At Christmas was like a knockdown, drag out, yelling, at Christmas. And I was able to, with my having learned and practiced empathic listening, listen to both sides, in kind of real time. And then I got them to start using empathic listening with each other. And then the whole family gathered around and turned into this whole family empathy circle. And we kind of talked for like an hour and a half. And it ended with hugs, all around, basically.
That's great, yeah.
It was very beautiful, And it was like the issue was totally something different than it seemed like the original issue was. The original issue is where some gifts were being kept and who was responsible for the kids getting into them. And the real issue was one of the family members not feeling like they really belonged and were accepted. And when they felt that acceptance, it was, those big hugs. And that's led to a whole series of empathy circles within the family that we do, fairly often, and use kind of some methods for family mediation. So I'm very much in
a perfect example of that, of it happening later.
Yeah. So just in terms of your question, I guess I would throw it out there that your inquiry, I would say, I think it's really possible, very doable. It's hard work, but.
It is. It's hard work. And that's one of the considerations is, the amount of time it takes. How long did it take you and your family to be more empathically communicated?
It's still an ongoing effort. What happened after that initial conflict that was mediated, then my sister and sister-in-law, who had been in conflict for like 8 years, and my sister even moved out of the state to be away from sister-in-law, that they said, okay, we're willing to do a mediation. We did like a 3 or 4 hour mediation, and they worked through, these problems that they'd had. Plus they got a set of tools of empathic listening and a structure that they were able to work out, have some tools for that. And then that led to my sister-in-law saying, oh, I want another circle with, my brother, her husband, because he never talks. He's so introverted. I want a circle around that. So we had another circle, of 6 of us in it during a 4th of July, and we used empathic listening methodology for like 4 hours talking about childhood memories and stuff. And then that's led to other conflicts and other topics like financial issues and so forth. So anyway, it's been leading kind of a building process to create more and more of that dynamics within the family.
And I think that your example is a really great example on how people learn, right? It's experiential, right? You need experience to learn it. You can't just sort of be taught it in a book and, shown it on a board.
Lectured, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, as social workers, we certainly lecture a lot less than, a business school would. But I think we have to really look at our curriculum and how we teach our students, not just the conceptual nature of what we're doing, but the felt experience of what it's like to do that. And that's a lot harder work, right? And that requires a professor to know how to do that too, right? And so that, I think, is the direction in which maybe my head is going as I look to my next study or two to see, if we have a professor who's doing that and what their tools are. But in general, that's how we teach kids, right? You can sit down and tell your kid what to do, or you can sit with them at the playground and help them do it, and it's a much different experience. So thanks for sharing that.
I think you're on the right track in that sense. You're looking for the superstar, the social worker, empathic social teacher superstar. There's I'm kind of based a lot of my work on the work of Carl Rogers and his methodologies, and he talks about the best way to learn empathy is to have an empathic teacher. I mean, someone who's very empathic. And it sounds to me like that's what you're actually looking for is, where are those needles in the haystack, who are the kind of if you have them as models that, maybe really see how they're doing it and give them a bigger voice. Yeah.
Exactly. That's the hope. So it's a much shorter study, if a year, which is what our last 2 studies have been, is not enough time, I don't know that my next study is going to give us enough time either, because that's just 1 semester of the 2-semester year. But we're going to do our best and see if we can find something. And if not, we have more to do.
And what is the next study? It's I saw it's a trauma histories to see how the partner, experience.
Yeah, that's what we just completed, and we're still analyzing that data.
And then what's the next study then?
The one where the teacher superstar, where we're looking at the students and the teacher. That's the one coming up in September. Okay,
and it's going to be just at these 3 universities, or do you have a wider net that you're casting? Or
no, yeah, this one is every single incoming student at USC. In the traditional classroom. So I'm taking the lens away from the other universities and just looking at what I can control, which is this class. And there's, I think, 28 or 29 sections of this class that each have about 20 students in it. So we're hoping that one of the 30 teachers will impact empathy scores more than others, but we'll wait and see.
Well, what about the empathy scores in the sense that, from my understanding of these is it self-assessment?
It is self-assessment.
That they're notoriously inaccurate. I mean, that's just what I've heard. I just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
We're going to use the same measure we've been using, and we're also going to, we're in the process right now of, we haven't submitted our IRB paperwork yet because we need to find a second measure of empathy. We do want to use a second measure to see if maybe this one we've used the past 2 years isn't evaluating what we think it is. But that being said, the measure we're using was just written up in a 2015 article where somebody had the participants use it to determine where their affective and cognitive empathy was, and then did a brain scan. And it was able to light up, and they were able to find that the scale was accurately assessing where cognitive empathy was and affective empathy was. So it seems that the scale we've been using is a pretty validated and reliable scale. But with that, that caution that you're suggesting, we are going to use a second one too.
I know there was a study that Carl Rogers mentioned where they want to see how empathic are therapists themselves, because it's core of therapy. But what they did is they had a panel. I think they had a panel of 30 other therapists who would rate, like a second party rating of the therapists. They took like the top, I don't know, 6 or 7 therapists, had them do, you know, really recorded their work, and then they had this other rating, you know, other people would rate them and I guess aggregate that. So I guess that's...
Well, thank you. I want to find that research. Can you send that to me or
Oh,
tell me anything
definitely.
you know about it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I haven't read that. That would be really interesting to see.
Okay. And the other question I have is about your work. Is it, my sense is there's so much of this kind of research is like a one-off kind of a research project. And it tends to, you know, you do one thing that it really, I don't know if the Arizona group is still focusing on this, but it seems like it really takes a deep dive to really get to some significant findings. So I guess I'm wondering are you and your group like in it for the long term, or what's kind of where are you with this?
It's a really good question. The 6 of us are very committed. After the first study, we have all sort of found different niche in which we want to focus. Dr. Roque and I have been continuing to focus on this trying to answer this question: if social work schools teaching empathy. 2 other partners, Michal Sela-Amit and Jennifer Lewis, have actually used the qualitative interviews that we did and developed an empathy scale. And they're now pilot testing that to see if they can teach therapists to be aware of when their empathic connection, I'm not using the right words, but it's becoming more fatigued maybe than at other times, and what client, you know, just being more self-aware of their empathy at all times. And so they're, you know, excited about that and testing that. And then, you know, there's side projects around online counseling centers and empathy and things that we're also thinking about. So overall, yes, this is a long-term project. The research we just finished with the 3 universities, we got permission from the participants to follow them for the long term. So we will be following up with them at the end of this year, which will be when they receive their master's degree. And I'd like to follow them for the next 5 years as they go out into the world, collect their licensing hours and get licensed, and see if that's the experience part that we're missing from school, right? That school isn't good enough to teach you. And even though they have internships, you really need to be a working social worker and having that experiential learning to really shift your empathic attunement for your professional development. So that's
exciting that you're in for the long term. You have a whole kind of spectrum of different areas you want to explore and build on.
We're trying.
I'm trying. Well, there's one last question here. You know, I interviewed Marco Iacoboni, who is a neuroscientist down there in LA, UCLA or somewhere, and he has a research lab there. And we've talked about the problem of the definitions of empathy, that it's really rather of a mess. And he said he's been working on this for quite some time on empathy, and he says he's been talking with his colleagues that there needs to be a real good typology of empathy. There's a lot of stuff, you know, buried in the literature, but it's hard for people to understand. And I'm coming up across this with, like, I don't know if you know Paul Bloom. He's written some articles against empathy, and he's working on a book now against empathy. I had an article called Against Empathy in the New Yorker, and I'll send you some info on him. Please. But and I've been having some email conversations. He's he's a psychologist and works out of Yale, does all kind of child behavior work and so forth. But it's like he's like attacking empathy, but he's not even really. It's not even what I would call empathy. And then it's so because he's kind of criticizing secondary response, I would say. Like, if you're like super sad, depressed, and then I become depressed and sad, or you're like totally happy and I become, you know, totally happy. And he's calling that like empathy. And he said, whereas I would say the empathy is following someone else in their experience. For example.
What you're describing that he's calling empathy. Alan Shore, who's a neurobiologist at UCLA, he would call that projective identification, not in the Kleinian sense of projective identification, but that, you know, if you do brain scans of a therapist and client, and the client starts to feel really emotional, there's a certain part of their brain that will ignite that same part in the therapist's brain when they're empathically connected. But then if the therapist takes that on and starts to feel that, right, that's identifying with the projection that's being sent to you. And so I wonder if maybe that's what he's talking about rather than the empathic connection, as you're saying.
Exactly, yeah. And so anyway, there's all these little very subtle aspects like that. It's, you know, at the kind of the higher view, the 50,000-foot view, it can kind of look like the same thing until you really get down to it and you see that, you know, this is a different, you know, quality that we're talking about, and that there's no, but anyway, Marco Iacoboni was talking about that there's no good typology that's like you can really point to make those differentiations. And then, you know, the academics are using, you know, some academics are actually using empathy for that word. What was it? Projection? The
projective identification, yeah. Projective
identification. So they're actually using empathy for that. So it turns into a pretty big mess in terms of trying to unravel all this. So I don't know. What do you think about the whole definitions?
I agree with you. You know, when you do any research, you have to operationalize your variable, right? And you'll see this in any research study. Depression, for one research study, is really just defined as sleeping disturbances, eating disturbances, and a dysphoric mood, right? And depression in another research study is looking at a different typology of depression. So I do think that's a problem with understanding research and talking about research, is really qualifying what you are terming what empathy is. And as a group, we noticed that there were lots of ways people were naming empathy, right? Some people said empathy had 6 components, 5 components. We ended up sticking with the affective part and the cognitive part because that made sense to us. It speaks to me from neurobiology, the left hemisphere of our brain and the right hemisphere of our brain. So it just worked with sort of my world view of how I'm seeing, you know, clinical material, and the scale was validated and we went with that. But somebody could be doing really great research describing it a different way with 5 components or 6 components. And, you know, I think, you know, as researchers, we need to be really clear that there's different ways to see this. But yeah, overall, it's a problem. And, you know, when we interview the students, I struggled sometimes because we'd ask them about empathy, but they were really talking about sympathy.
Right.
And so that's an issue too.
Yeah, well, these are all things I have been dealing with too. It's like, you know, with the definitions, and like even the affective and cognitive, like it's like, are you seeing the affective is more that empathic mirror neurons? You know, when you see an action, you do an action, you're feeling kind of the emotion, feeling into the experience of others. Whereas the cognitive is that from that experiencing into the experience of feeling into the experience of other, you can see intentions, you can see underlying needs, you can kind of get a whole picture of who the person is. And that picture, or almost like that mental model, is cognitive empathy. Is that how you see it?
As a matter of fact, the way that mental model you're talking about, I think, is true empathy. I think that in order to get true empathy, you need the cognitive piece, which is understanding, right, that what happened affected this person, and this is logically why that affected the person, but also effectively feeling, right, what that must have been like as the person talks about it to you. And in real good psychotherapy, which you have done with your family, not just understanding it and appraising it in a way and feeling it, but then giving it back, right? Giving it back to them, and this is what I'm hearing you feel, this is what I'm hearing you say, this is what I'm hearing of your experience. That's sort of the 3-part in my mind of how we do it. So in the scale, we're looking at the cognitive appraisal of which is the first step in couples counseling, right? You might not agree with why she's upset, but can you understand why she's upset, right? And then sort of the felt experience of what that must have been like, and that together with that mental model is empathy.
Okay. So it's like that broader mental model of having the reasoned connections as well as the felt experience, having the felt experience within that, and that whole kind of constellation of the felt experience as well as the relationships between them is what you're seeing is empathy.
Yeah, using the word mental model gives it a cognitive grasp, but sort of, that interconnected, you said constellation or picture, or I hate to use the word schema, but sort of the two integrated together.
Oh, okay.
Where they meet is empathy in my mind.
Okay, so the empathy is
give it back.
Oh, okay. So there's three parts that I see. Then there's also that you have that experience of the other, their felt experience, as well as the relationship of those felt experience, and that you have the capacity of reflecting it back to them, to where they feel that they can kind of acknowledge that that's what they've felt, or that's their experience.
Right.
Okay. What about the part, what I would call imaginative empathy, which is the role playing, in terms of that I can know who you are, you're a researcher, you're at UCLA, you're female. I could take that on, and then like an actor, like, Meryl Streep, being, playing Margaret Thatcher or Julia Childs, she takes on that person, having that basic understanding of them, maybe of watching their experience, their expression, the nuances of their expression, and she like lives that experience in terms of a imagined role play, but that she's connecting to her own emotions that come out within that context. And I've been just calling that imaginative empathy, and I'm just wondering how that kind of fits in.
As you were saying that, I was thinking, I thought of Peter Fonagy. Are you familiar with him and his concept of mentalization?
No.
How part of sort of a higher order way of being is when you can imagine what it's like for the other person in an experience, and truly getting that, which is a left-brained process. And you're talking about not just understanding it, but embodying it for a role, for instance, with Meryl Streep as an actress. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. Is that empathy, or is that, could she have, I guess the question I would have is, could she play someone that she's never been, or does she tap into her own personal experience to portray that? Because empathy, there is a level of being extracted, right? I've never had breast cancer, but I can imagine, or I, hopefully can empathically connect to somebody who's experiencing breast cancer. I don't need that personal experience to go there. But in an actor's world, don't they tag into a personal experience and imagine that personal experience in order to act out what they're doing?
Well, it seems like there'd be levels of that. You can just get the most. I've seen it within mediation, conflict resolution, like in a circle process, where one person doesn't want to attend, like, in the conflict, maybe the father doesn't want to attend, like a family. So you can actually have a person that does role play that actually takes on the role. They're a facilitator, and they will be like a stand-in for the father. And the basic dynamics of who that person is they're very close, they're very rigid, and just a few other little, cues like that. And within the context of the dynamic of, the family dialogue, everybody's like amazed at how this person who's never met the father is like channeling the father. So there's something about having like minimal cues, and it seems like you can keep building those cues, right? You can like Meryl Streep probably studies the nuances, the mannerisms, so you can keep building, building, building to be even, you know, more and more, you know, accurate in terms. But you can start. Seems like you can start with like almost a minimal foundation there.
That's a really interesting concept. I'm going to need to think about it.
Oh.
I don't know. I've never thought about that in terms of, you know, acting and empathic connection. I actually have someone in my neurobiology study group who works just with actors. So I'm going to bring that up to her. That's interesting.
Okay. Well, I guess that we'll have something to talk about the next time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is there anything in closing that you'd like to, anything cover that you felt wasn't covered, or?
No, I think it's been a great conversation with you, and thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.